My wife forgot our anniversary for the first time in 41 years last spring. Not the date. She knew the date. She'd written it on the wall calendar in the kitchen the way she always did, but she forgot what it meant. She looked at my face across the breakfast table while I held the card I'd picked out, and I watched her try to remember why I was smiling at her like that. That was the morning I stopped telling myself it was just stress. Eleanor was 63. She'd spent 30 years teaching second grade at Riverside Elementary in Macon, Georgia, and every child she'd ever taught remembered her. Parents stopped her in the grocery store to say their kids still talked about Mrs. Holt. She had that quality, the kind of warmth that made people feel genuinely seen. Watching it disappear, piece by piece, was the loneliest thing I've ever experienced. I'm Raymond Holt, 67, retired pharmacist. I spent 4 decades behind a counter reading labels and catching errors, and I still missed what was happening right under my roof. That's what I have to live with. Our son Derek lived 40 minutes away in Warner Robins with his wife Simone. He worked in commercial insurance, drove a leased SUV, wore the right clothes, said the right things at family dinners. Simone had a way of steering conversation that I used to admire. Smooth, confident, always knowing when to redirect. I understand now what that quality actually was. When Eleanor's confusion started, Derek and Simone stepped in immediately. That was 18 months ago. At the time I thought we were lucky. I traveled twice a year to consult for a regional pharmacy chain. Nothing extended, a week here, 10 days there. And knowing someone was looking after Eleanor made those trips bearable. Simone would come by in the afternoons. Derek handled Eleanor's prescriptions after I mentioned I felt strange filling them myself. Too close to it emotionally. They organized a weekly pill tray. They drove her to appointments when I was away. They were, by every visible measure, devoted. There were things I noticed that I chose not to see. Simone asking once, in a casual voice, what the house in our neighborhood was going for these days. Derek mentioning, twice, maybe 3 times, that a financial planner he knew specialized in elder transition planning. The way they'd both go quiet when I walked into a room where they'd been talking. I wrote each thing off separately. Taken individually, none of it meant anything. It was our pharmacist, a woman named Gloria Reeves at the CVS on Riverside Drive, who broke something open. I'd taken Eleanor in for a routine pickup, a new blood pressure script from her GP, and Gloria pulled me aside while Eleanor stood near the greeting cards. Gloria had been at that location for 12 years. She knew our faces, knew our insurance, knew what we typically filled. She spoke quietly, leaning slightly over the counter. "Mr. Holt, I want to ask you something and I hope you won't take it the wrong way." She glanced once at Eleanor. "Who's been dropping off Eleanor's prescriptions lately?" I told her. Derek, sometimes Simone. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at her screen, then back at me. "Are you aware of everything currently in her profile?" I said I thought so. She turned the monitor slightly toward me. There were 2 entries I didn't recognize, not from Eleanor's GP. Filled at a different location across town, transferred in 6 months ago. The prescribing name was a doctor I'd never heard of. "I'm not able to tell you more than what's in her record," Gloria said carefully. "But as a pharmacist yourself, you'll know what to look at." I stood there for a long moment looking at that screen. My hands were steady. The rest of me was not. I wrote down everything she showed me before I could second-guess myself. Then I went and found Eleanor by the greeting cards. She was holding a birthday card with a picture of a golden retriever on it, smiling at it softly. I put my arm around her shoulders and said nothing until we got to the car. The drive home felt like driving through a different city than the one I'd lived in for 30 years. Same roads. Nothing was the same. That night after Eleanor was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and looked up both drug names on my laptop. The first was a generic anxiety medication, low dose, nothing alarming on its face. The second one stopped me cold. It was a benzodiazepine, a class I know well from 40 years behind the counter. The specific compound wasn't commonly prescribed to humans in that formulation. The dosage listed in Eleanor's file was within a range that, over time, in an elderly patient would cause progressive cognitive impairment, memory disruption, confusion, disorientation, the kind of slow grinding decline that looks, to anyone who isn't testing for it specifically, exactly like early-onset dementia. I sat there until 2 in the morning reading everything I could find. I kept thinking, I'm a pharmacist. I spent 40 years catching other people's mistakes, and I had missed this entirely. In the morning I called Eleanor's GP, a man named Dr. Waverly Oakes, and asked him directly whether he had authorized either prescription. He hadn't. Neither was in his system. He grew very quiet on the phone and asked me to come in without Eleanor. When I sat across from Dr. Oakes that afternoon, he had already made some calls. The prescribing physician listed on those scripts had retired 18 months ago, right around the time Eleanor's symptoms had started, and his DEA number had apparently been used on a small number of scripts in the intervening period. Dr. Brer, Oakes chose his words carefully, but what he was telling me was that the prescriptions might not be legitimate. Raymond, he said, I want you to get Eleanor's blood drawn today. Full tox panel, specifically flagged for benzodiazepine metabolites. Don't tell anyone you're doing it. I didn't tell anyone. We went that afternoon. Eleanor asked if this was a regular checkup, and I said yes. She accepted that. She'd gotten used to accepting things she didn't fully understand, and the awareness of that, the knowledge of how long she'd been in that position, sat in my chest like something physical. The results came back in 36 hours. Elevated benzodiazepine levels, consistent with regular oral ingestion over an extended period. Dr. Oakes called me at 7 in the morning. His voice was different from our normal conversations, flatter, more careful. He said the concentrations were not consistent with therapeutic use. He said he was obligated to report and that I should speak with an attorney before anything else. I called my brother-in-law, Franklin, who'd practiced family law in Macon for 30 years before retiring. He listened to everything without interrupting, which took discipline on his part because Franklin was not a quiet man by nature. When I finished, he said, Don't confront anyone yet. Get the evidence assembled first, and Raymond, be very careful who you tell. That same afternoon, I went back through everything I could access. Eleanor's weekly pill tray. I photographed each compartment. I found 2 tablets I couldn't identify among her regulars. I removed them and put them in a sealed plastic bag. I replaced them with identical-looking vitamin D supplements I found in the cabinet, matching by size and color as closely as I could manage. Old habits. I called a private lab in Atlanta that does independent pharmaceutical analysis. It took 3 days and $200. The results confirmed the compound, the same benzodiazepine in Eleanor's blood work, in the exact dosage range. While I waited for those results, I watched my wife. I had not changed anything else about her environment, same meals, same schedule, same routine, except for those 2 tablets per day. Within 48 hours, she was sleeping less during the day. By day 3, she asked me, out of nowhere, what I thought about repainting the living room. It was such a normal Eleanor question that I had to leave the room for a moment. By the end of the first week, she was doing the crossword again, slowly, imperfectly, but doing it. The morning she stood at the kitchen window watching the birds at the feeder and said, without being prompted, Ray, I think something has been wrong with me for a long time, and I don't know what it was. That was the moment I understood fully what had been taken from us. Not a disease, a theft. Year by year, Sunday by Sunday, every time Simone came in her bright blouse with that organized pill tray. A theft. I sat down with Eleanor that evening, and I told her everything I knew. I kept my voice steady. She listened without speaking, which was not her usual way, and when I finished, she sat for a long time looking at her hands. Then she said, Derek did this. Not with anger, with a kind of grief that was worse than anger. I said I believed so. I said I wasn't certain yet of everything, but that we needed to be careful until we were. She nodded. She reached across and covered my hand with hers. Then she said, I want to understand all of it before I see his face again. The next morning, Derek called to say he and Simone would be coming Saturday to help Eleanor with her medication for the week. I kept my voice completely ordinary. "Of course," I said. "We'll be here." I called Franklin that afternoon and told him it was time. He connected me with an attorney named Vivian Sharp in Atlanta who specialized in elder law and financial crime. She had a way of listening that made you feel she'd heard everything before, not in a dismissive way, but in the way of someone who wasn't going to flinch at whatever you said next. I laid out everything: the pharmacy record, the blood work, the lab analysis, the substituted tablets. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. "You've done this exactly right," she said. "Most people confront first and document second. You did the opposite." She told me what the next steps would involve: official blood work submitted through proper channels, a report to Adult Protective Services, and an interview with the Bibb County Sheriff's Office. She told me that depending on what the investigation turned up, we could be looking at elder abuse, fraud, and criminal administration of a controlled substance. She also told me to act normal on Saturday. I have never been an actor. 30 years of retail pharmacy, you develop a face for difficult conversations. The one you use when you're about to tell someone their insurance won't cover what they need, or that what they're taking interacts with something else they were prescribed. A neutral, steady face. I used that face on Saturday. Derek and Simone arrived at 11. Simone was carrying a bag from a sandwich place downtown. Cheerful, easy, setting things on the kitchen counter like someone entirely comfortable in a space that wasn't hers. Derek asked how Eleanor had been this week. "Fine," I said. "She'd had a few good days." I watched Simone move toward the pill tray. Eleanor was sitting in the sunroom pretending to read a magazine. "I'll take care of those," I said. Simone paused. "Just a half second, but I've been watching for it. Oh, don't worry about it, Dad. I've got a system." "I know you do," I said. "But I'm a pharmacist. This one I'd like to handle myself." Something crossed Derek's face. Not quite alarm, more like recalibration. I offered them lunch. We sat at the table and talked about nothing: Derek's work, a neighbor's new fence, the weather. I was somewhere outside my own body, watching myself hand sandwiches across the table to the people who had been slowly poisoning my wife. Eleanor came in from the sunroom, and I watched them both take in the fact that she seemed more present than they'd expected. Simone's smile didn't change, but her eyes did a quick inventory of the room. After they left, I stood at the front window and watched Derek's SUV back out of the driveway. Eleanor came and stood beside me. "She was looking at my pill tray the whole time," Eleanor said quietly. "I know. You have a plan." "Yes." She took my hand and didn't say anything else. On Monday morning, I went to the Bibb County Sheriff's Office. The detective who took my statement was a woman named Investigator Carol Maddox, and she had the specific quality of someone who had learned to be unreadable. She took everything I gave her: the pharmacy records, the tox reports, the independent lab analysis, the photographs of the pill tray. She asked me about the financial situation. I told her about the house. We'd owned it outright since 2009. No mortgage, assessed at $420,000 in the current market. I told her about Derek's situation. He and Simone had bought more house than they could afford in 2021 during the rate surge, refinanced poorly, and I'd heard from my sister, who heard from Derek's former college roommate, that they were underwater by somewhere around $90,000. Derek had mentioned twice in the past year that we should look at our estate planning. I had changed the subject both times, the way you do when something makes you uncomfortable without knowing exactly why. Investigator Maddox listened to all of it without expression. When I finished, she said, "We'll need an official statement from Dr. Oakes and the tox results through our forensic channels. That will take approximately a week. After that, if the evidence supports what you've brought us, we can move to a warrant." I asked what I should do in the meantime. "Continue acting normally," she said. "Can you do that?" I told her I'd managed it for a week already. She almost smiled. The following Saturday, Derek called to say he'd be stopping by alone. Simone had a work thing just to check in on Mom. I said, "Come on over." He arrived at 2. Eleanor was in the garden. I offered him coffee and he sat at the kitchen table looking slightly more relaxed than he had the previous weekend, which told me he'd talked to Simone and they'd concluded the prior visit had gone fine. We talked for 20 minutes. He asked about Eleanor. He asked about my pension. He mentioned very casually that a financial planner he trusted had said the market was doing interesting things and that maybe we should look at restructuring some assets. I said I'd think about it. He mentions that Simone thought maybe Eleanor would do better in a more supported environment at some point, just if things got worse, just as an option to consider. I said I'd think about that too. At 37 in the afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I answered it. Investigator Maddox stood on the front porch with two uniformed officers. I stepped to the side to let them in. I watched Derek's face do something I don't have a good word for. A kind of collapse, the expression of a person whose version of events suddenly stops being available to him. Derek Holt, Investigator Maddox said, "I need you to stand up, please." He stood. He looked at me. I don't know what he was looking for. "Dad," just that, one word. "You are being detained for questioning in connection with the criminal administration of a controlled substance to an elderly person, and elder financial exploitation." She read him his rights in a steady, practiced voice. One of the officers moved toward him. "Dad, please, this is a misunderstanding, you have to tell them." "I don't have anything to tell them," I said. "I've already told them everything." The door to the sunroom opened. Eleanor stood in the doorway still wearing her gardening gloves, dirt on her hands, taking in what was in front of her. The sight of her, upright, clear-eyed, present, seemed to land on Derek in a way that his own arrest hadn't quite managed yet, his mother standing there and seeing him clearly. "Mom," his voice broke entirely. Eleanor looked at her son for a long time. Her face held something I recognized from 30 years of marriage. Not coldness, but a kind of grief she'd already begun to process before this moment arrived. Then she removed her gardening gloves and said, "You should go with them." They walked him out. A neighbor 2 doors down was watering her roses and stopped. A man from the house across the street paused on his driveway. The ordinary Saturday afternoon of our street rearranged itself around the fact of my son being placed in the back of a police vehicle. The following months moved in a different rhythm than I expected. There were statements, hearings, meetings with Vivian Sharp that ran long. The investigation expanded to include Simone. It emerged she had been the one to locate the retired physician's DEA number and identify the pharmacy across town with lax oversight. Derek had obtained and administered the medication. They had, between them, researched Eleanor's likely trajectory, estimated the timeline before cognitive decline would support a guardianship petition, and begun preliminary conversations with a realtor about the house, conversations we found in a text chain on Derek's phone that the sheriff's office subpoenaed. The house had been a target from the beginning. Derek's attorney entered a plea negotiation. Simone's attorney did the same. The DA's office prosecuted both. In a courtroom in Bibb County on a gray Tuesday in February, Derek Holt, my son, was sentenced to 9 years for criminal elder abuse, conspiracy to commit financial exploitation, and unlawful administration of a controlled substance. Simone received 6 years. The judge, a heavy-set man named Judge Thomas Keene, who'd been on the bench for 22 years, addressed Derek directly before delivering the sentence. He said he'd seen Gree dressed up in many different costumes, but that dressing it up as caregiving was among the most contemptible he'd encountered in his time on the bench. I sat in the first row. I didn't look away. Eleanor sat beside me with her hand in mine, and when the gavel came down, she exhaled slowly. The way you do when something you've been bracing for finally arrives and you discover you're still standing. We have not been back to the courthouse since. Spring came to Macon early that year. Eleanor is in the garden most mornings now, and I watch her from the kitchen window while I make coffee. Her recovery has not been a straight line. There are still mornings when words leave her mid-sentence, still days when she tires faster than she should. The neurologist we found, a woman named Dr. Fiona Marsh at Mercer School of Medicine, says the compound can leave trace effects and that Eleanor's brain has shown genuine resilience. She says she expects continued improvement. We hold on to that. Derek can have visitors. I have not gone. Eleanor went once, 3 months after sentencing, alone. She came home and sat at the kitchen table for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "I told him I love him. I also told him I don't know when I'll be back." She looked at me. Was that right? I told her there was no wrong answer. Franklin stopped by that evening, as he tends to do, and the three of us sat on the back porch until it was fully dark. He brought sweet tea, which he always does, and we didn't talk about Derek or the trial or any of it. We talked about the garden, about the way the neighborhood had changed since we moved in, about a trip Eleanor wanted to take to the Georgia coast before fall. I had been asked to speak twice now at an elder abuse awareness event put on by the Bibb County Bar Association. The first time I almost declined. The second time a woman came up to me afterward and said her mother was showing symptoms she'd been told were dementia, and she'd never thought to question whether there was another cause. She asked me what the first signs had been that something was wrong. I told her the first sign was that I noticed something and decided not to look. That's the thing about the people who love us and mean us harm. They rely on exactly that, on the fact that we will look away because looking means considering something we'd rather not consider. They understand that love is also a form of blindness, and they use it. I still fill Eleanor's prescriptions myself. I read every label twice the way I did for 40 years for other people's families. Some habits, it turns out, were always the right ones. I just forgot to apply them at home. We've started taking walks in the evening after dinner, something we hadn't done in years. Down our street, past the neighbors' roses, to the park at the end of the block and back. Eleanor talks about her second graders sometimes, kids who are probably 40 years old now, who learned to read in her classroom, who she helped through the slow work of making letters mean something. Last Tuesday evening, halfway to the park, she stopped walking and looked at me in a way she has. An evaluating, affectionate look I've known since I was 26 years old. "You saved my life," she said. "I need you to know I know that." I told her she'd been doing a fair amount of saving of her own. She thought about that. "Still," she said. We kept walking. The evening light was doing something particular to the oaks along our street, that Georgia spring light that comes through at an angle and makes everything look like it's worth paying attention to. We walked to the park and back without hurrying. There was no reason to hurry. We had the time. I think about Gloria Reeves a lot. A pharmacist at a CVS on Riverside Drive, a woman I'd exchanged maybe 200 words with over 12 years of routine pickups. She didn't have to say anything to me that afternoon. She could have looked at her screen, handed me the bag, and sent us on our way. Nothing in her job description required her to turn that monitor toward me and ask if I was aware of everything in my wife's profile. But she did it anyway, quietly, carefully, in the way of someone who understood exactly what she was risking and decided it was worth it. That's what I mean when I think about doing right by people. Not the dramatic version, not grand gestures or public sacrifice, the small daily decision to act with integrity even when no one would notice if you didn't. Gloria noticed something wrong and she told the truth about it. That single honest moment gave me everything I needed to save Eleanor's life. And then there's what I did with it. I've turned this over many times in the months since the sentencing. I'm a pharmacist. I spent 40 years reading labels and catching interactions and protecting strangers from errors they didn't know were happening. I had every professional instinct required to catch what Derek and Simone were doing, and I missed it entirely because I applied those instincts to everyone except my own family. That wasn't humility, that was a failure of clear thinking. The kind that comes from deciding in advance what the truth is and then interpreting everything through that decision. What saved Eleanor wasn't luck. It was the moment I stopped protecting my assumptions and started following the evidence. I documented before I confronted. I verified before I accused. I called Franklin, then Vivian Sharp, then Investigator Maddox, people who could see the situation without the weight of loving Derek in the way I loved him. That discipline, that willingness to think carefully when every instinct was screaming at me to act. That's the thing I'm most grateful I managed. Because the evidence was only useful if I handled it correctly. One wrong move and Derek's attorney would have turned my grief into reasonable doubt. There's a kind of strength that doesn't look like strength from the outside. Eleanor has it. She sat across from our son in a prison visiting room and told him she loved him, and then she told him she didn't know when she'd be back, and she meant both things fully and simultaneously. She didn't collapse into forgiveness, and she didn't harden into bitterness. She held both truths at once, which is harder than either extreme, and she walked out of that room and came home and put on her gardening gloves. That's not something you're born with. That's something you build over a lifetime of deciding day after day who you want to be. Derek had that same opportunity every day for the year and a half he was slowly poisoning his mother. Every afternoon Simon organized that pill tray was a day Derek could have stopped it. The consequences he's living with now are not punishment handed down from somewhere outside himself. They are the accumulated weight of the choices he made when he believed no one was watching. I think that's the thing worth carrying out of this. What we do when we believe there are no consequences is exactly who we are. Gloria knew that. Eleanor has always known that. Derek learned it too late. I still fill Eleanor's prescriptions myself. I still read every label twice. We still walk to the park on Tuesday evenings when the weather is right, and sometimes we don't talk about any of this. And sometimes we don't talk about any of this. And sometimes we do. Either way, we're walking. Either way, we're here.